we are passing through a very strange period of human development, in which the very meaning of development has been turned upside down. In the name of development, we are poisoning the food that we eat. In the name of development, we are poisoning the waters of the oceans, the rivers, and the aquifers underground. In the name of development, we are poisoning the air. And in each of these, the poisons that we release are the kinds that will not be removed for the next several thousand years. Recently, a study concluded that within 10 years, the entire soil of Punjab will be worthless for agriculture because of the extensive poisons that we are pushing into the earth. The kinds that we cannot remove, which we cannot undo. These poisons are not only coming back to us, in our children, but they're coming back at a level where they destroy the very seed of life. In Pondicherry, where I live, a recent study pointed out that in the mother's milk, which is the most pure nourishment for a newborn baby, there is more DDT than acceptable limits of safety. And this comes from the food that the mother eats and the water that she drinks, which is polluted by the farmers putting that DDT on their crops so that they may kill pests and get a little bit of extra return. And the system of DDT cycle is so deep, once it gets into the human body, the body cannot remove it. It cannot distinguish between DDT and fat. And it continues to accumulate it and now gives it to the newborn baby. In the recent nuclear disasters that have taken place, the poisons which have been released in the air are right now in the atmosphere that we are breathing. And as they get into our system, they play havoc with the endocrinal balance. All of the fine balance of the human body and life systems are upset by these very fine radioactive particles. And there is nothing you can do about it. There is no way to filter it out from the air that you breathe, not just for you, but for your great-grandchildren, 7 generations down. In the old Indian tradition, we were taught that every time you act, you must consider the consequences that go down 7 generations. Not just what happens immediately, not just what happens tomorrow, not just what happens to you or your children, but 7 generations down. But today we don't teach that anymore. That mindset which brought India this extraordinary development, the greatest development in human history, that mindset itself has been removed and replaced by an alien mindset. A mindset which thinks in terms of short-term benefits. The next quarter profits. Does not matter if the quarter after that involves destruction of the whole company. You have to somehow show increased profits and increase in increase. Obviously, it is unsustainable. The poisons which we have thrown are also destroying animal life and plant life, again at a genetic level. In many lakes in the USA, which is far less polluted than India, they have discovered that fish are changing gender because the estrogen that has gone into the lake water from plastic waste that we have thrown into the landfill. Consider how much more plastic waste gets thrown in India, how much more estrogen goes into the natural cycle, and what it must be doing to the fish and the plants and of course the human beings. Except that such studies are not done in India. Fortunately, perhaps, we remain ignorant of the destruction we cause. But at the rate at which we are destroying, it will be a surprise if humanity survives for much longer. We are actually in a passage where we are destroying ourselves, we are making ourselves extinct by our own peculiar ideas of development. In the name of this peculiar development, we are putting our children through the most extreme form of torture. Mental torture, physical torture, emotional torture, such that their personality itself is damaged, that they grow up to be neurotic. In America, 50% of the population needs to refer to a psychiatrist, and it is considered normal. 50% of the marriages end in divorce. Stable marriages are typically second, third or fourth, and it's considered normal. In India, 4,000 children commit suicide from pressure of exams, and nobody even bothers to raise this as an issue in the media. Instead, we are busy discussing things which have no relevance at all for the future. In every field that humanity has tried to improve, and this is the strange paradox, in every field where we have tried to improve, we have ended up becoming more destructive. And why is that? Can we even begin to understand and reverse the process in time? Sri Aurobindo, writing about 100 years ago, described this whole period of transition in symbolic images and then explicitly in detail, described the psychological conditions, the psychological changes that we would have to pass through, their rationale and what they could lead to, what could be avoided, what seems unavoidable. And that narrow passage through which perhaps humanity might just barely manage to escape self-destruction and grow perhaps to a greater, meaningful, sustainable, real, lasting, evolving future. He described in those writings 100 years ago the rise of Bolshevism in Russia, its distortion into statist communism, its eventual breakdown, and the return of the now broken Soviet Union into a community of independent states. He described the struggles that Europe would have to go through, including the passages of integration, economic, political, and so on, until eventually Europe would have to be reorganized as a United States of Europe. The European Economic Community is today in fact using exactly those terms as the only possible solution for the present economic crisis. He described the eventual entanglement of dependencies of all the countries of the world, economically, culturally, politically, leading to a larger world union and the dangers of a one world government and the necessity and the means to avoid that so that we can have a community of nations rather than a one world government. When the League of Nations was formed, he spoke of how it would have to break down and what were its flaws. When the United Nations was formed, again he pointed to its flaws and said, even after this, one more structure would have to come. But in all of these, he gave a rationale of why, how, and the whole psychological process of human development. I would not go too much into that. Some of you would be familiar with those ideas also. But I'd rather describe the very point of the crisis and the possibility of the future. In psychological terms, Sri Aurobindo said, this is a spiritual crisis, an evolutionary crisis which is a spiritual crisis. All the others, political, economic, social, religious, and so on, are merely symptoms of the spiritual crisis. And as an evolutionary crisis, it is a point where what has been developed so far, even though it reaches a peak, is found to be insufficient. And it is this insufficiency which is eventually hitting us in the face, not staring, hitting us in the face. And it is the insufficiency of the intellect. The character of the modern development, the very word modern, is the reliance on rationality, on the power of the intellect to organize human life and make it perfect. Unfortunately, that has not happened. Every step that we have made with the power of rationality, with science, technology, or otherwise of organization, social, economic, political, every step that we have made, we have found that it has problems which are greater than the solution which we found. And so we think perhaps if we rationalize better, we might be able to go a little more. When the government enacts new laws, and this is the problem of Anna Hazare's movement. You enact new laws, you create new structures to solve an existing problem. But that new structure can be sabotaged, misused, abused. And then what? Who will be the check on the one who checks? Who will protect us from that ultimate authority? There is no answer. The only answer we are led to, ultimately, we have to change. Systems are good, systems are useful, systems are necessary, but the people who run the systems determine whether the system will be misused or properly used. Ultimately, it all comes back to us, we have to change. And what? In what way? It is the rationality of the mind which has reached its limit. To go to something higher, what does that mean? We don't even understand it. And yet we are being pushed to it. And if we cannot rise to it, then we fall apart, we perish. The nature of the transition is not unlike the transition from the monkey to the human, when rationality was first introduced. The ape that could make that transition grew to be Homo whatever, eventually sapiens. But the ones who could not fell back and remained perhaps even inferior. Such is the nature of this transition. Sri Aurobindo goes so far as to say there will even emerge out of humanity as if a new species based on this new consciousness. It's a very interesting idea because according to biologists, the sign that a species is heading for extinction is a narrowing of diversity. If you see in plant life, a narrowing of diversity is the first sign you know it's going to get extinct. In animal life, similarly. Interestingly, the human genome has never been so narrow in its diversity, which has led many biologists to conclude that perhaps we are heading for
Can you explain
extinction.
a little bit that narrowing of diversity?
The diversity of the genetic variations in the human genome has narrowed to such a point that we have a very fine, narrow common ground and therefore insufficiency of adaptability. And when changes come, the narrow diversity then dies out, which is the problem we're facing today even in agriculture. Because we have replaced the earlier wide range of diversity of grains by a few specialized grains, When the bug hits, you have widespread famine because there is not enough diversity to oppose and resist the changes. If suddenly the climate changes and becomes hotter or cooler, there will be widespread famine because there is insufficient diversity. So it is the same with the human. Sri Aurobindo observes that interestingly, while the human evolution has brought us to this point of a genetic, let's say, specialization, it has created a form that is capable of enormous psychological diversity. And he points to the human psychological types and the psychological diversity as the sign of the future. The body has been so made, and there's a very interesting passage in the Upanishad where the gods look for a vehicle to manifest on earth, and various animal forms are offered, and they say this is not good enough. But when the human form is created, they say, this is it. And then they enter and settle inside the human being. It's a very symbolic, profound passage. But the idea is, the human being is the one form so evolved that without changing the physical material, there can be enormous psychological and spiritual growth without limit. And this, within this is the potential and the promise for the future. And we point to this one characteristic. Everywhere on earth we find, especially among the younger generations, a very clear sign that the children are refusing narrowness. They are refusing to be bound into fixed grooves, fixed systems, narrow religious traditions. They want to go wide. They want to know more. They want to, as if, universalize. This instinct is so deep-rooted. And you notice that through the media exposure, they are allowed that experience. Through books, through television, through the internet. The child in your house today has more access to what happens in the world than any of us ever had when we were their age. But not only he has more access, he makes use of that access which we do not at our age. Isn't it? What drives him to want that? He wants to know widely. He wants to experience the whole earth. This impulse is a deep impulse that nature is implanted and is pushing within. And it's the first clear sign of the nature of the human mind as it is evolving. We might even say, children today are not interested in specializing, they can't hold attention, they can't go deep, they don't have a power of concentration, but in the universalization, for the short term, there is a necessary side effect of a shallowness, apparently. But when this widened mind now takes to a focus and depth, it can go far deeper and be much more inclusive than a narrow specialization. And if this correction can be brought about in the second round, then perhaps we would have achieved something more useful. The second sign which you see all over, and it is almost as if by compulsion of circumstances, even if you want to remain narrow, you cannot. It's as if life breaks through your walls and brings into your home, into your life, the necessity for an acceptance of multiplicity, richness, diversity. Countries which try to remain isolated fall back rapidly, shrink and die out as if, economically, politically, intellectually. You can't remain isolated. But also you notice, the way things are working, the interdependence grows such, you're forced to get to know the other. Otherwise you will not survive. And if this is true economically, because of interdependencies across countries, it is equally true in our own homes where we live. Our neighbor, the food they cook, the lifestyle they have, well, it affects us. We create community housing structures because there is no other way. for security, for sharing of resources, to bring down costs, whatever reason we may give. And interestingly, particularly through the economic entanglements, we are forced to meet the very people that we do not like. You see, especially here, the coming together of the polar opposites of political systems, of social priorities, of religious distinctions. A clash of religions is one of the most prominent forms that we see today. Especially in the last few days, perhaps you have seen how this takes a pretty radical turn. And yet through those clashes, what is it forcing people to? It's forcing us to acknowledge that the others also have a different view, which may be as legitimate to them as my view is to me. And if our views are polar opposites, is there a point of reconciliation? Yes, we can take a position that we must learn to tolerate each other. And this has been the thrust in most inter-religious discourse of the last 30 years. But tolerance only postpones the problem. Because tolerance recognizes that there is a problem. You accept that there is a problem but prefer not to deal with it. Eventually the problem festers, grows until it explodes. Tolerance is not a long-term solution. The long-term solution involves a mutuality of understanding. And in understanding, a growing respect. And that's the change in consciousness that is required. So when we speak of transcending the intellect, transcending rationality, it does not necessarily mean a high spiritual consciousness in some abstraction. It means we begin to widen our consciousness first, to begin to understand extremes of experience and viewpoints, and perhaps even experience them in ourselves and find a harmony, an integration in our experience. And so you see, in this shift, inevitably, a turn away from objectivity and objective rationality, a turn to a subjective experience. When all else in life has failed, what is left? A few of us have, I will say, the great gift of having passed through the experience where everything is taken away from you. And I say this consciously, it is a gift. Whether you're in business, whether you're in a job, whether you live any kind of life, if you have had this gift, you will know what I mean. When everything in life is taken away from you, what is left? The only thing which you have is yourself. But not yourself, this person who's afraid, who's disturbed, who's in pain, who's suffering. Not that self. Behind, deep within this disturbed personality is a kind of strength that emerges at that point, that simply knows, whatever may be, now I will come through. Not only it knows, it has the strength to survive. And even as the systems around you fall apart, even as all hope is lost, something comes up with a strength that takes you through. And when eventually your whole life is rebuilt, you wonder what took you through. But that thing which came out, which came forward briefly for that while, that is the strength, is the innate knowledge that is in all of us. Perhaps the extreme forms of the crisis of humanity, where our survival is at stake, may become the trigger for humanity as a whole to discover this strength, for this innate knowing and certainty to come forward briefly and give us the right direction and take us through the passage of darkness. We can hope that will happen, but we need not wait for it. We can make that effort even now. And that effort begins by an introspection. The transition Sri Aurobindo observed from this age of rationality which has failed to a new age of a higher consciousness, the transition is characterized by this turn inwards, a subjective age as he calls it. The subjective age realizes that modernity has failed, and you speak of transmodernity and postmodernism and so on. But the character of that postmodernism is recognizing that each one has a subjective experience, and that is as important, perhaps more important, than our shared objective experience. And there is really no shared objective experience, truly speaking. And these are all the kinds of philosophical discourses they have. But the point being, a return to the recognition of what you experience within yourself. But not to stop in the first step. Sri Aurobindo points to the development in Europe in the last century, when Germany was the most developed in this sense. It had developed the full potential of the rationality, organized its life, organized its arts and cultures to their highest rationally possible, and was ripe for entry into the subjective transition. But its first entry in the subjective transition was a recognition of its own greatness, of its own superiority, which was fine, perhaps as a first step, but it stopped with that. It stopped with that and recognized its own egocentric superiority as the truth, as the reality, as its purpose, and thus the outcome of the world was. In fact, if you see the way the Second World War particularly unfolded, it was driven by a total dedication in Germany. A dedication involving a great idealism, and yet the form it took was so perverse, so shocking, that humanity even today remains shocked. And this happened because the subjectivity stopped with the ego consciousness. And its idea of the highest of the human possibility was this aggrandized, exaggerated human ego. This error, having been made so powerfully, has been repeated later, but within limits. What you saw in the US under the Bush administration was another form of that same character expressed. A country that wants to dominate the world and chooses the destiny of humanity based on its own immediate self-interest. The same pattern you see gradually emerging in China. I'm not yet mentioning India. Will India go the same way? In the last election which you saw in the US, in the clash between Obama and Bush, we saw something very interesting. On the one hand was the national ego, wanting to dominate the world. On the other hand was a representative of a great idealism, a man who touched hearts, who inspired people, and who as if represented the first emergence of the American soul. And in that last slip where Obama finally came forward, we felt and saw the soul of America emerge briefly and then rapidly being covered up by the general noise and chaos. But that was a sign and a promise that perhaps America can make that breakthrough. The question now comes to India. We also may have to pass through a similar transition, collectively, but more so individually. Let me deal with the collective issue first. In the national consciousness, and I speak of the general sense of the Indian identity, we have passed through very painful passages. We have had some strange experiences, the likes of which very few civilizations have had. And these have been so painful in their impact that we have not yet recovered from them. The first was a period of decline in the last 1,000 years, involving painful invasions, culminating in colonial rule. Under colonial rule, we found also, over a period of 50 years, a complete unwinding, breakdown and destruction, extermination of the whole economic political framework of India. From being one of the most powerful economic countries of the world, producing 24% of the global industrial output, we went down to becoming zero. And all the industries which ruled the world literally when the British came in were wound up and shut down. And a series of famines over 50 years involved death of 30 million Indians of starvation. Now over 50 years, when you have starvations involving 1/10 of the population being wiped out, you can think of what it would do to the mindset of the people. You fall back to your survival mode. Everything else falls away. All your high ideals, all your efforts to do anything meaningful just drops away. How can I survive with food tomorrow? There is a famous letter from the Viceroy of India to his boss in England, where he writes, "The plains of India are littered with the bones of the people. I have never seen so much misery." And this is a 50-year period, 2 generations, enough to wipe out a lot of knowledge and a lot of culture and traditions. Enough to drive a people to forget that they can ever be free and that they ever have an identity. And finally, at the end of the Second World War, just before partition, we had another famine in Orissa and Bengal when the British took away the grains grown by the Indian farmers by force and caused a famine where 4 million died. No one speaks of these things. You all know that in the Second World War, 6 million Jews were killed. Does anyone ever tell you that 4 million died of starvation because their own food that they have grown was taken away, or that 30 million, 1/10 of India's population died from the direct outcome of British policies, or, and here I'm going to speak of the thing which no one wants to talk about, when partition took place. It was the largest human migration in human history. An entire civilization torn apart, a body ripped apart, bleeding. And it has not yet recovered from that pain and shock. These are the kinds of wounds that have been inflicted on this culture, on this civilization. It's so painful that no one will talk about it. And if you have heard stories from your parents, grandparents or great-grandparents, it stopped there. We don't speak of it. Why? Because it's still too painful. We have a lot of psychological traumatic problems as a culture. And yet, this is the one space where unbroken tradition for 10,000 years exists. No other space in the world has an unbroken tradition of 10,000 years. An unbroken tradition which is spiritual in essence. All other cultures have had ideals, great ideals, but none has had the spiritual ideal as its dominant theme. And this is the reason why, in spite of all this, India not only has survived, not only is rebounding, not only is thriving, but will recover to something still greater. Because the spiritual ideal is the turn to eternity, the turn to immortality, the turn to infinity. Universality of outlook is innate to the Indian culture. And therefore, when the world faces this clash of extremes, the solution will be found in India. Because it is in India that this culture of universality has already been deeply embedded in us. So deeply that even if we are not conscious of it, it's there. General B.C. Joshi, former Chief of Army Staff, made an extraordinary observation in an interview on television 15 years ago. He said, "It is my experience and my conviction that in the very genes of every Indian is spirituality." Now this man should know. He leads people who stand up ready to die for their country. He should know what the mettle of the people is. And he says in the very genes that spirituality exists. There's a fascinating writing of Sri Aurobindo just after he had come out of jail under British rule, where he had a series of revelations and the whole direction of the spiritual journey was shown to him. And then he pointed out, because it is in India that this resolution for human problems will have to be found, therefore, as if by a divine providence, by the divine will, there has been a special preparation also. The traumas that I spoke of earlier, civilizational traumas, are perhaps to be seen in that context. But most importantly, he said, in this space, the quality of the sattvic character has been especially embedded to a point where it has been exaggerated, to a point where almost as if the rajasic element is removed and the sattva becomes almost like a tamas. But it has been embedded for this reason, so that when the rajas emerges again, it will always be under the leadership of the sattva. It's a very technical description, but what that means is, the inertia which you see in the last 200 years in India is not endemic to us. Is not the character of the civilization. You only have to go back 500 years, and if you go back more than 1,000 years, you see a thriving civilization, where every field of life has been explored, mastered, and taken to spiritual heights. Nothing has been left untouched. And in each field there has been that bold, adventurous conquest. That kind of vitality you see missing in the last 1,000 years, and especially in the last 100 years, where the mind of India was conquered by the British. Deliberate policies, the mind being conquered, the mind being enslaved, it's taken a while for things to emerge. Sri Aurobindo observed that the kind of energy that he put for India's freedom, if he had put that much energy in Europe, there would have been 3 revolutions at least. But in India, because of the inertia that had got embedded in the collective consciousness, it only had a few shake-ups. But that inertia has to pass, and you can see the difference already in the last 20 years, let's say. And yes, the threat, the fear that we all have, will we go the way of the West? Will we lose everything we have? The answer to that is precisely this. This sattvic temperament has been so deeply embedded that even when the rajasic awakening takes place, and there is this passage through an imitation of the West, and an emergence of all the chaotic energies at first, it will not overwhelm the sattvic ideal. And yet there has to be that passage of the energies being released first. And in their first release, they will necessarily be chaotic. And then we learn to rein them in and organize them. But always under the guidance and light of a superior ideal. And I'm pointing to these nuances of the awakening because it is necessary for us to understand why we are passing through this confusion. As the rajas emerges, the tamas fades away, the sattva momentarily may be covered up, but eventually will emerge, will push forward, because that's our deepest temperament. And I'm speaking collectively of India. As far as it comes to us individually, we have the same issues. In each one of us, according to our temperament, the same pattern repeats in different ways. But I want to point to something which we can all begin to do individually. In this turn of the subjective introspection, we have always believed in the Indian tradition that the greatest power, the greatest knowledge, the greatest fulfillment of the heart in love can come only from that which is the origin of all things, from the divine, whatever name you give to it. We have also realized as a civilization that that divine origin of the universe is also our own divine origin. And therefore, in this inward turn, if we seek to find that, to feel that, to enter in relation with that, then our highest potential is drawn out. And only the highest is worth working for. This has been the turn of the Indian civilization. It's good to have intermediate ideals, intermediate objectives, but always pointing towards the highest. You may never realize it in this lifetime, doesn't matter, but that you're moving towards it is what is important. If you start with an intermediate goal, when you reach it, you're lost. Because already by that time circumstances have changed and that goal may have no relevance. But when you aim for the highest, wherever you are, you're always meaningful. And there's always something more fulfilling ahead. And the very focus on the highest goal brings you its influence, because you turn to it, it responds to you. And the highest power, the highest knowledge, and the most complete love fills you, leads you, guides you. So in our own lives, to make that special effort, to turn inwards and enter in relation with our deepest and our highest truths. And there are many ways to enter in that relation. One is in the movement of bhakti, the heart opening and giving itself in love to the divine. Whatever form that takes in your own tradition, according to the imprint of your own personality. But if you sit for a few minutes, turn inwards with the image or the idea of the divine, and let your heart open and give itself in love, and remain immersed in that communion. The glow of that love, the perfume of that communion